Hello and welcome. In this time of the coronavirus, we hope that everyone is safe and healthy. And today we're going to be sharing Pivot Learning's presentation on assessing and improving the impact of K-12 curriculum implementation with our partner, Stockton Unified School District. The agenda, so we're going to talk through who we are and also who is our partner, Stockton. We also are going to discuss why are we doing this work and why we think high quality instructional materials adoption and implementation is so important. We're going to talk about what we're doing, so our model, and then specifically continuous improvement, what that looks like in curriculum implementation, and then what that specifically looks like with Stockton Unified School District. And at the very end, we're going to have a bit of a roundtable, kind of modified this from the original in-person presentation, and focus this on a discussion around coronavirus and how that specifically impacts the model and the work with school districts. Next slide. And sorry, then one more slide, next slide. So I'm going to start today with introductions. So my name is Allison Carter. I'm a vice president at Pivot. I lead a portfolio of work around our curriculum implementation work.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Mackey. I'm a senior program manager at Pivot, and I support the curriculum and instruction program.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jignasha Pandya. I'm a program manager at Pivot Learning, and I also support the curriculum and implementation portfolio at Pivot.
And then the one person we're sadly missing is Sanja Lowry, who is the Assistant Superintendent for Education Services at Stockton Unified, who is understandably focused on the district in this current context. Okay, next slide. So I just want to start with a quote here from Zaretta Hammond, and really this is kind of our why of why we do this work. So we believe at Pivot, and our partners believe that students of color and low-income students are not receiving high quality, rigorous, and standards-aligned, grade level standards-aligned materials, and that is directly leading to the achievement gap. Next slide. So just a little bit about who we are. So Pivot is a nonprofit. We have over 25 years of experience and expertise focused on district and school leadership and systems change. A few years ago, we acquired our subsidiary Core that also has a 25-year history focused more directly on school sites and classrooms and directly on curriculum implementation. You can see here that as a nonprofit, we're very focused on teaching and learning, and we are also very focused on teaching and learning high quality curriculum adoption and implementation as a lever for equity and what we call educational justice. We are also very focused on creating sustainable change, scalable solutions, and then focusing on our impact. Next slide. We do work all across the US. So we were based and founded in California. And so we do a lot of our work there, but we actually work all the way across the nation in 18 states with about 100 districts and 1.5 million students. We have about a staff of about 30 people and 50 part-time consultants. Next slide. And then, like we've already said, we work in curriculum and instruction and curriculum implementation, but we also have other areas of work where we focus. So we also focus around prevention and intervention and secondary school improvement. And across all of our work, we do standalone research projects and evaluation, and we also do our best to use our programs to influence policy and advocacy. Next slide. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about why we think this work is very important, essential. So like I said earlier, we know students of color and low-income students have inequitable access to grade level materials. You can see here some studies that what we've been reading. So TNTP is the opportunity myth, where you can find the stat of 38% of classrooms composed of students of color have no grade level assignments. And then in EdTrust West research, the stat that around 75% of assignments in high poverty schools are not on grade level. Next slide. And then you can see here that teachers also are not given and are not using high quality materials, or are using materials that are completely unrated. And so here you can see ELA teachers, very small percentage in green of elementary, middle, and high school ELA teachers are using high quality materials. You can see a large percentage are using misaligned or not aligned or partially aligned materials, and then a very large percentage also, again, using materials that are unrated, and we don't know the quality of those materials. Next slide. And then you can see something similar here with math. A slightly larger percentage of math teachers in elementary and middle, especially elementary and middle, are using high quality materials, but still relatively small overall. And then in addition to that, in addition to the fact that the educators do not have high quality materials and high quality assignments to give their students, they also receive very little training or support. And so we know from this study that educators receive less than 4 days of training around materials specifically. Next slide. All right, and so based off this research, we have developed strategy that we will talk to you about right now.
Thanks, Allison. So this is Elizabeth. So what does all this research mean, and how do we think about it as an organization in our supports for districts? And what the main thing that we've realized is that there are two areas that we really see districts needing support in. One is generally building teacher and leader capacity across the district system to do this kind of work in a very different way, to do adoption and implementation with a different mindset and with different strategies. And then also to really frame and center this work around equitable student outcomes. And so in order to do that, we feel like districts really need support and resources and guidance on how to communicate to their stakeholders and design adoption and implementation of instructional materials around equity. So really helping people understand this is not a compliance process, it's not a technical process, it really is an equity move. And then we know that in general, from the research that Allison was just sharing, that educators, for one, need access to high quality materials, and then they need more robust and long-term training on them so that they can feel confident in implementing them and supporting all students in accessing grade level materials. And finally, we know that teachers, coaches, and principals need more than just a 2-day publisher training, which is typically what districts offer, that they really need training that is over multiple years. We recommend 3 to 5 years to really nail an implementation. And then also that support be embedded within their context in their day-to-day. Next slide. And so what all of that means is that this is an adaptive process. It is a process that requires changing behaviors and mindsets, changing processes and systems. It is not a technical process, one where you can build a project plan and run it without any adjustments or modifications. And we also know that it is a long-term process. It takes a while for people to learn new tools, materials, behaviors, and mindsets. And so we really work with districts to help them understand this work in the context of adaptive change. So not solved with one-off quick fixes, that it really requires thinking beyond just distribution of materials and looking for the use of materials, but really thinking about priorities and beliefs and habits specifically related to equitable instruction. And that it requires working cohesively across a system and across different stakeholder groups. So it's not just the responsibility of curriculum and instruction, but rather the responsibility of many teams working collaboratively across a district. Next slide. So our model then is built on that approach and on that mindset. Next slide. So we think about curriculum implementation as requiring support across all levels of the district ecosystem. And so we offer support that aligns to that. We work with district leadership to help them build the capacity of their system, their people, and the processes that they use for implementation across multiple years. We help them understand the many different work streams that are involved in it in successfully implementing materials. And then we also provide supports for school site and classroom level leadership. So one of the tenets that we believe is really important in implementing materials is that educators need to understand the underlying content in order to effectively use high quality materials. So we provide pedagogical professional learning to support that. And then we also believe that to effectively use materials, teachers and coaches and principals need that just-in-time, on-the-job support. So we work on site-based implementation supports throughout multiple years to support an implementation. Next slide. And there are a few things that we think are really essential to an effective implementation. The first sort of foundational element is that a district really does sort of a need finding and understands from their community and different stakeholders what the need is around curriculum materials and the implementation of those materials, and then that they set a vision that is district-wide in service of that feedback and in service of equitable student outcomes. We also know that districts need to bring together a cross-functional team. So really thinking strategically about implementation and pulling in different departments. So obviously professional learning, but thinking about communications, measurement and learning, thinking about, distribution and purchasing, like all of these different departments that get pulled into an implementation. And we think that, and this is where continuous improvement really comes in, we think that to effectively run an implementation over multiple years, you really need to have a system of measurement, learning, and evaluation that is an ongoing collection of diverse kinds of data that informs your implementation work and allows you to make real-time adjustments. And then many districts, we know, often have many partners who are working on larger strategic initiatives like a curriculum implementation. And so one of the things that we'll often work with districts on is aligning those partners with the district-wide vision. So making sure that everybody's rowing in the same direction and that everyone is really clear on how their particular strength as a partner feeds into that larger district vision in service of equitable student outcomes. Next slide. Another critical component that we think a lot about and work with district leadership on is communications and stakeholder engagement. So in order to effectively shift mindsets, in order to effectively roll out new materials or get people to trainings, you really have to have a robust communications plan that is stakeholder specific. So we work with district leadership to help engage different stakeholders throughout the entire implementation to both provide information, but also gather ongoing feedback about how the implementation is going for those folks. As mentioned before, we think pedagogy is a pretty critical part of being able to effectively implement materials. So we offer pedagogy professional learning in ELA and math, and that's really meant to help educators understand the science of reading, sort of how to do the math, so that when they get those materials in hand, they're spending their cognitive energy on learning the materials and not learning the underlying content. And then finally, we provide site-based implementation support. So really going into school sites, observing lessons, digging deeply into the adopted materials to understand how implementation works for teachers and coaches at a site-based level, on a classroom-to-classroom level. And we really focus a lot on the integrity of the implementation. So are folks using materials in the way they were designed? And then how is that going? What additional supports do they need as the year progresses? Next slide. And so in order to, for a district to really see a different outcome from implementing high quality instructional materials, we believe that we need to create sustainable systems. And that's why we think about this as across the district ecosystem, from classroom leadership all the way up to district leadership. What we're really focused on is building not the capacity of an individual or of a school, but really thinking about how do we create a system that can reproduce these results as new materials are adopted over time. And as you see different priorities or focuses come in for a district, how can you sustain this work? And so a lot of that is really focused on building really solid systems and processes and tools that can move beyond 1 year or several years. And one of the ways that we provide support for that is we offer a training of the trainer model for coaches, teachers, and site administrators, so that when we're gone, they're able to sustain this work in a way that makes sense in their context. Next slide.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone, this is Jignasha. So we are now going to talk a little bit about how we leverage continuous improvement to support our curriculum implementation work. Next slide. So we can use continuous improvement strategies to help us ask the right questions to assess where we are and where we want to go. So how do you know your materials are high quality? Are those high quality materials in the hands of your educators? Are your educators getting the support and training to effectively use these materials? How would you measure the efficacy? Are your educators using these materials effectively? How do you improve effectiveness? And how are you measuring changes in instruction and student outcomes throughout the implementation? And what should we be measuring? Continuous improvement can help us ask the right questions and then also get at the right answers. Next slide. So we believe that continuous improvement is essential to this work. We know that to boost longer-term outcomes for students, districts, and schools, we have to enact changes that are systemic and sustainable. In our work with school districts and CMOs, we empower educators to design curriculum implementation systems that are designed equitably and designed to sustain. We do this by partnering with school districts and CMOs to build, test, launch, and evaluate systems using continuous improvement framework. And the continuous improvement framework of Plan, Do, Steady, Act. And we employ these different and continuous improvement strategies at every level of the system, from central office to the classroom, to set goals, develop plans, and identify indicators of success to measure, to evaluate progress towards the goals, and to ensure continuous improvement. Next slide. So ultimate goal is to build and sustain a multi-year implementation plan for our LEA partners. Here's a high-level flowchart of the process. So we start out by completing needs assessment to identify the user needs. The users here obviously being our students, but also the professional stakeholders, the adult learners in the system, the teachers, coaches, principals, curriculum specialists. Using that discovery data, the next step is to identify the why, how, what, and who, meaning the mission, vision, and theory of change, the planned curriculum implementation, and the stakeholders. Who is going to be driving this work, and how will that be shared back with the different stakeholders? Next is to develop the overall project goals and outcomes, including benchmark and ensuring alignment to the overall vision and theory of change. So once we have the overall project goals, we identify the workstream owners and the workstream goals, and ensure alignment again back to the overall project and the theory of change. Of course, we won't know how effective a plan is if we can't measure progress. So part of our work is also supporting the development of robust evaluation plan that takes into account both qualitative and quantitative measures. So each year of the project is then broken out in 6 to 8 week continuous improvement cycles through utilization of what we call sprint cycles, which we will get into a little bit later, where we engage again in this plan, do, study, and act Next slide. So here we have the 6 core principles of continuous improvement, and we'll talk about how those principles look like in action for our curriculum implementation work. So the first principle is make the work problem-specific and user-centered. Our North Star in this work is access to high-quality, grade-level materials for all students. And everything that we design in our project plan ultimately leads to this North Star. The next principle is variation in performance is the core problem to address. And the way we come at this in the curriculum implementation work is thinking about variation in mindset, behaviors, and skills that exist in the adult learners and addressing that through targeted professional learning experiences, but also addressing the variations in implementation that are bound to happen, especially in the first year. For example, we conduct site visits during the first year of the curriculum implementation project to evaluate curriculum implementation fidelity and use that data to make iterative changes to the implementation plan to, again, ensure progress towards this ultimate North Star. The third principle is see the system that produces the current outcomes. So our needs assessment and design, we do the needs assessment and then we design aspects of the systems that are missing or redesign aspects of the systems that are not aligned. Based on that, we again draft the overall and workstream specific project plan that helps us create the systems necessary to not just to produce the outcomes that we want and correct inefficiencies in the current system that's getting in the way of those outcomes. Fourth principle, we cannot improve at scale what we cannot measure. So we spoke a little bit about the robust evaluation plan and that we create that are both for the overall project and workstream specific. But we are also creating the processes and tools, essentially the evaluation system and systems that are needed to effectively deploy the evaluation plan. The fifth principle, anchoring practice improvement in discipline inquiry. So we utilize sprint cycles, and again, sprint cycle is a term that comes out of the agile methodology. The framework is much more utilized in the tech world, but basically it utilizes key components of user-centered design thinking. So each sprint cycle is 6 to 8 weeks, where teams plan, deliver, and review a small chunk of the year-long plan. And then they inspect and then adapt the way the work is done and or measured. We'll dig into a sample sprint plan a little bit later in this session. And the other thing that we do in this discipline inquiry cycles is make sure that we are getting stakeholder feedback from each level of the system. So feedback from teachers, coaches, and principals, also students. So if, for example, we'll talk about Stockton in a little bit, but we are doing student surveys there, and also feedback from the team that has been tasked with this work. So sharing back out the outcomes from a sprint cycle and getting feedback from the larger team to make those iterations. And the last principle, accelerating improvement through networked communities. So our approach to designing professional learning experiences is around cohorting the adult learners so that they can have this community of practice. So a problem of practice is similar across the different adult learner groups, obviously tailored to their individual needs. So we have ELA teachers that are cohorted around grade and the curriculum they're using, same thing with our math teachers and the principals and coaches. So that helps create this network community piece that helps sustain the learning. But we are also connecting districts to other districts who are taking on this work by utilizing our partners to, again, have the systems piece of the network community. So again, it exists at all the aspects of the system, from the leadership to the classroom. Next slide. So we're currently doing this work in Stockton Unified School District and are really excited to share what that has looked like there. Next slide. Here are some quick stats around Stockton Unified School District, just to set the stage. So Stockton Unified has roughly 2,000 teachers, 44,000 students, 80% of students identify as low income, 25% as English learners. In the 17-18 school year, more than 70% of students did not meet standards in ELA, and more than 80% of students did not meet standards in math. Before the start of the school year, 18-19, Stockton got a new superintendent, Dr. John Daisy, and he made adoption and implementation of high-quality curriculum materials a priority and a main charge for the district in achieving its vision of having students college, career, and community ready. Next slide. So Stockton brought together an adoption committee to identify the curricula they will be implementing that are shown here on this slide. Stockton has undertaken an ambitious plan where they're implementing 4 curricula across all grades in all schools. So as you can see, for ELA K6, they are implementing Benchmark, ELA 7-12, My Perspective, Math, Grade Span K8, Ready Math, and Math 9-12, and Vision. Next slide. And now I'm going to hand it over back to my colleague, Elizabeth, to share more about the why, how, what of our partnership with Stockton.
Thanks, Jignasha. So as we discussed before, one of the foundational things that Stockton did was the superintendent went on a listening tour in the first few months when he started and really got a sense from stakeholders of what were the most urgent priorities from families, students, and staff for the district. And what he developed was his vision document, which he entitled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" And in that document, he lays out a plan for the next 5 years for the district of what their priorities should be. And at the center of that focus is the adoption and implementation of high quality instructional materials. Previously, the district had been using self-created units of study to guide their ELA and math instruction. And so they adopted the materials that Jignasha just mentioned in the fall of 2018 and began implementing them in the fall of 2019. Next slide. And so the scope of Stockton's implementation work is they've made in addition to their instructional materials training and purchasing, they made a $2.5 million investment over 2.5 years that's being led by their district implementation team, which is a cross-functional team. And we meet with them weekly to support that work. And it is, and this is very crucial, it's sponsored, both by the superintendent, who set this as a priority for the district, and then also by the assistant superintendent of education services, Sonja Lowry, who was unfortunately unable to join us today. And she allocates resources and sets vision for that team. And then the team, the district implementation team, has a project driver and then leaders who manage each of the different work streams. So professional learning, measurement learning and evaluation, communications, equitable instruction, different areas. And they have built a multi-year project plan for 3 years that includes how materials will be acquired and distributed, what professional learning looks like for different stakeholder groups, and how equity is woven into all of those different training opportunities. And they also, in their project plan, have a multi-year plan for job-embedded implementation support that's site-specific. So in this year, we are visiting each of Stockton's 60 schools and working with all of the principals and coaches to support their ELA and math implementation. They developed and are continuing to implement a communication strategy and plan that aligns messaging across the district so that teachers and coaches and principals and families and other departments understand sort of how this work is moving forward and are able to provide feedback throughout the implementation. And all of that is really focused on the implementation of instructional materials as an equity move. And they're also developing their plan for sustainability. So how this work continues after our organization leaves, and how they're really building leadership capacity across that district ecosystem and the resources and processes that would support those leaders to continue doing this implementation work. And one way in which we're supporting is we're doing a training of the trainers so that they can run pedagogy trainings internally. Next slide. So as Jignasha had mentioned some of the demographics, this gives a little bit of a sense of the scope of the adoption and implementation. So K through 12 at the same time, ELA and math, which is a pretty ambitious project. And it's supported by the pedagogy training we offer, and then also site-based support. And that touches about 50 coaches, 60 schools, 60 principals. There are around 2,000 teachers and 44,000 students. And the training and support that we offer is aligned to the specific instructional materials that they have adopted. So materials from the Curriculum Associates Benchmark and Pearson publishers. Next slide. And now Jignasha will share a little bit about how we're thinking about continuous improvement and measurement, learning, and evaluation throughout this project.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So as we previously mentioned, having a robust evaluation plan is a cornerstone of our approach to curriculum implementation. So given the scope and the scale of services we are providing in Stockton and the additional partners at the table, it was really important for us to ensure that Stockton leadership had a lens into how the professional learning interventions were playing out in real time. We have been utilizing the following instruments that are listed on the slides to gather data and to do necessary analysis that let us effectively measure progress towards project goals and ensure continuous improvement. So as you can see, around project management, Elizabeth spoke to it being one of our components of our curriculum implementation project. We employ interviews and surveys to measure the quality. There's weekly assessment of the status of project deliverables and we use data to improve the implementation. And that happens in the weekly meeting that Elizabeth spoke to. We have also measuring at the base level, the access to and the quality of core ELA, ELD, and math instructional materials. The next piece being just access to and quality of training on the instructional materials, content and pedagogy, and the equitable instruction. The quality is measured both through participant surveys and quizzes. The big piece for us is ensuring integrity of the curriculum implementation year 1 and the quality of that implementation in year 2. And we do this through 250 site visits, measuring the use of materials with integrity. So we tailor these site visits with coaches and principals in mind to ensure that it's meeting their learning needs, and also helping them norm around what integrity looks like for them in their school district and what does quality look like. We survey all stakeholders around the experience and their perception of implementation. So not just the stakeholders in the school district, again, being your students, your teachers, your coaches, your principals, your curriculum specialists, central office staff, but also the community at large. So Stockton this spring administered a survey for all of the district staff members and had plans to implement a student and community survey that is on pause currently because of COVID. And of course, student achievement, that is ultimately our North Star. So also continuing to measure student achievement, both through the benchmark testing and state testing, but also the unit assessments and summative assessments that are embedded in the curriculum. Next slide. So where does continuous improvement fit in and what does that look like day in, day out? So we spoke earlier about our sprint plans, which is the 6 to 8 week improvement and inquiry cycles where the work stream owners and the overall project participants take the year-long goals and chunk them out to plan, do, study, act, and make iterations as needed. So under plan, as I mentioned, year-long goals are broken down into the 6-week sprint cycles. These are the actions, key events, and the indicators of measurement that helps us measure progress that occurs during the 6-week sprint cycles. Study, at the end of the 6 to 8 week cycles, the project owners and the workstream owners report out the progress, what ended up actually happening, what didn't happen, what data do they have, and what does this mean for their plan going forward, which leads us to act, which is iterating on the sprint cycle goals and or process as needed. The reporting out happens to, as I mentioned, a larger stakeholder team. So they are able to get perspective that they might be missing for themselves. So Stockton has convened a diverse implementation team that represents different stakeholder groups from, again, teachers, principals, counselors, parents. And this ensures that all of the lenses are present and helps us create the most robust plan. Next slide. So here is a sample sprint plan that we thought would be helpful for you guys to kind of see what this looks like and how the planning works. So here we have a sample goal of getting feedback on curriculum implementation for at least 50 families. This is a communications goal, and that's a year-long goal. As you can see, that goal is that's tied to the year-long goal of making sure that families are enlisted in getting the feedback. And this goal is then broken down into 6 weeks. So the key events here are superintendent listening sessions. This is actually something that Stockton did do with families to get feedback on the new curriculum. They were also going to do teacher testimonials and create those testimonial videos and then continue the listening tour. So as you can see, that goal is then chunked out into what are the key events, what are the action steps, and the data targets, what's actually going to be measured. And here you can see that the measurements are number of families providing feedback, number of families attending events, and number of testimonials created. So this is just what a year-long goal chunked out into 6 weeks could look like. We will have this sprint plan available on our website for reference if you guys wanted to dig into it a little bit more. Next slide.
So now that's the end of sort of sharing just generally about our model and our approach and what that looks like in Stockton. We had initially planned for when we were having this as an in-person session for a conversation and discussion, and in hopes of kind of generating that feel a little bit, we're going to do a roundtable around 3 questions that we believe might be important for districts right now. Next slide. So Allison, do you want to go ahead and, or excuse me, Jignasha, do you want to go ahead and share about our first question there?
Sure. So our first question is, during this unprecedented time, how can a system leverage continuous improvement to ensure progress towards big goals? So uncertain times are opportunities for design and to ask what if and how might we. At Pivot, we have aligned a continuous improvement process to the D School's design thinking process. We know that design thinking lends itself best to situations with no known solutions. We have yet to know the ramifications of the situation we are in, and we are definitely in a time of high uncertainty with no known solutions. The school districts and CMOs across the countries are already doing rapid experimentation and trying brand new ways of delivering instruction and supporting staff. The why of the work here has not changed, just the how and the what. So districts can use this opportunity to get really focused on the users and design prototypes around their problem of practice and test them and iterate them and then scale them as needed. I think the continuous framework of plan, do, study, act can really be leveraged in this time of uncertainty. And it aligns really well with the ideate, prototype, test, and refine parts of the design cycle. So my recommendation to a system currently would be to identify an opportunity and then to plan for that change, to implement that change on a small scale. So this would be the do piece of it. And then for the study piece is to use data to analyze the results of the change and determine whether it made a difference. And then the act piece being, if the change was successful, implement it on a wider scale and continuously assess the results. If the change didn't work, begin the cycle again. And at this time, I think it also would be helpful to continue to leverage the 2 of the principles of continuous improvement, which is collaboration, making sure that stakeholder groups have the open lines of communication, are able to speak to their needs and provide feedback, and also the piece around the network community. So how are we coming together? Because a lot of the systems are dealing with similar challenges. to be able to share the shared learning and to learn from each other.
Jignasha, it makes me think, one of the challenges that districts are encountering right now that we've heard from is how to do online instruction, how to leverage, a video conferencing platform to do instruction. What do you think like a short cycle would look like if they were approaching, using video conferencing with their students? What do you think how do you think they might set that up?
So I think that could be a short term and a long term, right? Like right now, there needs to be a way for students to engage with learning, but with a smaller group, with teachers who might be ready to act, they can test out what can student-led work look like. So one of the dangers of course, moving rapidly to online is the cognitive load will end up back on the teachers. So there could be multiple design cycles that could be taking place at the same time. So while all the students are accessing some learning online to make sure that it's effective learning, that could be the problem of practice around which a district can start designing cycles. So it could be looking at a unit ahead and with a small group of teachers designing aspects of the learning that can be more truly aligned to the in-person experience that's currently halted.
Great. And Allison, anything you wanted to share or add on that?
No, I was just thinking about not only thinking about how to set up the test, but also thinking about how to collect data. Collecting data from students who are maybe part of this pilot or prototype, and how you might do that through surveys or through quizzes or through informal interview type scenarios.
Yeah, so I think thanks, Jignasha and Allison for digging into that. I think there's a lot here that districts are trying to process quickly and figure out solutions for, and certainly feel like continuous improvement could be an effective strategy. So the second question that we had was, what would be some unique challenges that districts or charters should be thinking about around curriculum adoption and implementation specifically for next year? So certainly there'll be some short-term adjustments that folks will need to make to timelines, potentially, procuring or distributing materials, and resource adjustments as districts are needing to reallocate resources in response to the COVID-19 shelter-in-place orders or stay-at-home orders, and having to move to online learning. There's a lot of very quick adjustments that are happening. But beyond that, beyond sort of the technical of getting students and teachers set up online, getting materials, access for those groups, there still will be, I think, this same ongoing question of what does equitable access to grade level instruction and materials look like as we go through potentially multiple periods of ongoing virtual learning? How can we ensure that students, both have access to the internet and online high quality materials, but then also as instruction is happening, in real time or asynchronously, how can we ensure that there is still equitable access, that students are getting what they need? And I think sort of secondarily to that, what is the professional learning that teachers will need and coaches and principals to allow for a really robust, equitable learning experience for students? And so thinking about that in a virtual manner as well. How can we adjust some of these learning experiences? And that's something that Pivot's doing a lot of thinking on right now. And then I think finally that both of those shifts, for students and for teachers and coaches and principals, those shifts are going to require that a district begin doing some real systems building and capacity building around a virtual learning environment. And so really thinking through some of those things that we had identified earlier, measurement and learning, communications, professional learning, materials distribution, all of those things, thinking through them in a different way and through a different lens as we have a pretty uncertain future ahead of us in the next couple of months. Anything, Jignasha or Allison, you'd add to that?
Yeah, I love what you mentioned around the equitable access to learning, even in these uncertain times, and especially if we move virtually. The piece that I would add there is also ensuring support. I think the inequity piece of the situation will really come to head, knowing that it's not just around the technical pieces, right, of access to internet or Chromebook at home, but also the learning environment, and how do we support our students who might have added responsibilities at home, or just might have other things that are happening. We know that there will be a lot of different ramifications of the social distancing around job losses and whatnot. So how are we also providing support to our students in addition to providing access to learning? And then the other piece I would add is this is also an opportunity for K-12 systems to kind of look at their post-secondary partners who had to figure out some of how to support virtual learning for different student groups, and look at what are some of the lessons learned already that they can implement, so they don't have to quite reinvent the wheel here.
Thanks. Anything you'd add, Allison?
I think just emphasize the systems piece. Basically all of the, like you said, Elizabeth, all of the systems thinking that we do with districts for in-person engagement is still applicable for virtual, but you obviously have to think about material distribution differently if everyone isn't in the same place. And you have to think about evaluation, certainly teacher training differently, and evaluation of students, of instruction and student learning differently if it's being done virtually. So I think that we all of us in the education sector need to be thinking about how to build those systems effectively but efficiently, given the current context and the uncertainty, certainly in the next few months, but maybe even in the next year or more.
Thanks. And so the final question that we have, Allison's going to walk us through how we as an organization are thinking about and approaching these shifts.
Sure. So as you can probably already tell, we have been doing a lot of thinking, as is true of everyone around the US and the world. In the last 2 weeks, and we've been doing a lot of listening and talking to school districts about their needs and trying to think about the best strategies and systems and resources that we can provide districts. And we are thinking, very specifically about the trainings that we talked about earlier, the pedagogy trainings, that are aligned to materials trainings and how to move more of that virtually. We've also been talking about our site supports and what that might look like as well virtually, how to do instructional coaching virtually, specifically lesson studies and even modeling lessons. How do you do that without students, and data studies and planning and things like that. How to do those things virtually. So we're doing a lot of thinking, a lot of listening, and then of course doing a lot of building those systems on our end as well, as we think about the near-term future and then also the longer term.
Thanks, Allison. Anything, Jignasha, you'd add to that?
I think the one thing I would add, the way in terms of looking at a project level that I'm thinking about, is this is also an opportunity as a system, Pivot as an organization, and then for project managers as a unit of that system, to really partner with our partners to co-design and really leverage those principles of user-centered piece, like what are the needs of our partners, what are the unique needs of our partners currently, and how we can enlist them in the solution generation and implementation and evaluation. So I'm really excited for that opportunity that this very unprecedented event has presented us with.
Thanks, Jignasha. So I'll hand it over to Allison to wrap us up.
Great. So I think we move to the next slide. So, well, we've presented to you, but unfortunately have not had the opportunity to really engage with anyone as we had hoped for the in-person summit. So we, really would like to hear from you, take questions, have discussions. We know many of you are very busy right now, but we are here and available. Like we said earlier, we are listening. We really are interested in learning more from people in the field about what you all are doing around general curriculum adoption and implementation, but also the work you're doing now specifically in our new context. And I also want to thank Carnegie Foundation and also the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation for giving us this space to present. And I think that is it for today. And I want to wish you all well and stay safe and healthy, and we will talk to you all soon.